So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the CCP Reality Check special series. This is the episode 5 of the entire special series of this live streaming. I am your host, David Starwatcher. I'm from the Himalaya, Washington, D.C. farm. And tonight with me is our co-host, Sam.
Hello, I'm your co-host Sam. I'm also from Himalaya, Washington, D.C. farm. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Sam. And tonight we are going to look into some of the very important updates of the bankruptcy case of Mr. Miles Guo. So without further ado, let's get into the case. By the requirement of the law, I'm going to read the following disclaimer. This video is for educational and informative purposes only. We are dedicated to share with you what is really happening in China and to try our best to verify information used. Jointly, we fight back CCP propaganda. We highly value your independent research, critical thinking, and comments by the CCP Reality Check team. So now let's begin by moving on to the next slide. So today's we are still talking about for the special series on how the CCP infiltrates the United States judicial system. Let's move on to the next slide to see what we are going to talk about tonight. In this episode, we are going to look into these three things. We are going to look into the case number 22-50073, Mr. Miles Guo's bankruptcy case, newest updates. We are going to look into 1. The background, 2. The history review of both this case and some of the cases that eventually lead to the bankruptcy case. And 3, of course, is the hearing that occurred on August the 1st. Let's move on to the next slide. So we are going to do a very quick recap on the background information. As we see here, this is the entire relationship diagram that we've shown you, as some of the audiences and viewers might have already noticed in some of the previous episodes of this special series. This is the entire diagram on what we say as the diagram of the people who involved in the CCP's unrestricted lawfare against Miles Guo. And I already look into the fact that saying Bruno Wu, he is not only the mastermind, but he is also a registered agent in the United States, as we shall see in the next slide. This slide here shows the entire registration form of Mr. Bruno Wu, or Bruno Zheng Wu in this case. So this registration form shows Bruno Wu is an agent of the CCP. And Bruno Wu has a Chinese name called Zheng Wu, and Bruno Wu was involved in the CCP's unrestricted lawfare against Miles Guo. So some people may ask, how does Bruno Wu involve with CCP? Be patient, and let's move on to the next slide. I shall be explaining to you very clearly. Let's first recap and also take a look into the relationship between Paul Hastings and the PAG. Paul Hastings has a relationship with the PAG. As we see in the title of this particular slide, says Paul Hastings led PAG make 671 million bid for Spring REIT, and this is a merger and acquisition case. Let's move on to the next slide. There's something more. Jinshan Bank, which is a entity based in the Communist China, has hired Paul Hastings as the Hong Kong legal affairs representative and for the legal consultation and the legal counseling. And move on to the next one. We also will take a look that Jinshan Bank, one of the major shareholders of the bank, is what we see here. Let me enlarge a little bit because I have a little bit difficulty in trying to see it. This is the Harvest Fund management. So the Harvest Fund management is controlled by Bruno Zhongwu, and the Jinshan Bank is also a government-controlled and owned entity back in the communist China, which we call the state-owned enterprises or the state-owned entity. Let's move on to the next one. So now this is a very clear diagram, a summary of all the other two, or all the above three slides we showed to you. So Paul Hastings has a relationship with the Jinshan Bank, and Jinshan Bank as a state entity. One of the major shareholders of Jinshan Bank is called Harvest Fund, and Harvest Fund is controlled by Bruno Wu. As a state entity, it is impossible to do so without connection with the Chinese Communist Party regime. So this is basically the end of the relationship between the Paul Hastings, Jinshan Bank, Bruno Wu, and of course, its entire relationship with the CCP's unrestricted lawfare against Mr. Mao's score. But now we were looking into the history review to see why does everything comes up to the point of the newest update. Let's move on. This part, we are going to look in some of the history that will lead to the case. So let's look at the origin of the case. Part 1. Around April 17, 2017, the CCP's Ministry of Public Security issued a red notice via the Interpol. On April 18, 2017, right before Mao's Score's interview by the Voice of America, the PAX, which stands for Pacific Alliance Asian Opportunity Fund Limited Partnership, filed lawsuit against Mao's Score on the subject of a $30 million loan. On April 19, 2017, the Voice of America's live interview with Mr. Mao's Score was cut. Sam, so I noticed that the Voice of America is started surfacing on the origin of the case. And seems like the Voice of America has some very, very important significance here. Sam, would you please share with us of some of the very important critical points?
Yeah, David, you know, all these things, you know, they are related and they occur almost at the same time. So, you know, it's a very reasonable like assumption that all these things were coordinated and it happened at the same time. For example, for the Voice VOA, the April 19 VOA cutoff of VOA's interview with Mr. Mao's Score, it's a very famous like event in the whole like the foreign Chinese society. So everybody is asking a question, you know, the VOA is at least partially funded by our USA tax money.
That's true.
Yeah, they are paid by Americans like you and me, like our audience, you know. They are supposed to promote American values, right?
That's true.
But you know what? They cut off the interview according to the request of the red notice you just mentioned from the Chinese government.
From the Communist Party regime,
exactly.
Which is the CCP.
It's very, very ridiculous, you know. All these, you know, the time point and the moment of all these things is very suspicious, at least to me. Very.
That's true. I have to say that is true because when we're looking into all these 3 time points, yes, and Sam, you're right that you mentioned all these 3 dates are very close. So there's something more to that, and let's continue to take a look about the case of a PAX and about a complaint. So there's one thing about a complaint. as we already seen the case which is filed 1 day before the VOA's live interview, the 30 million loans that is mentioned by PAX was actually happened in Beijing back in 2008. And the loan was already paid off. And Miles Guo, acting as the guarantor of the loan, had his liability cleared or resolved. Basically, just cleared from all the liabilities in this case. Now, the case was actually first being dismissed, but then was allowed to proceed in the jurisdiction of New York. And it's very importantly to mention that Miles Guo claimed that some documents were fake and some signatures were forged. Therefore, his attorney filed a motion to investigate the authenticity of the documents. Sam, I'm sorry to interrupt you for a second, but usually at this point, it should be allowed to move forward, right, for this kind of request.
David, what confused me, David, what is, it's a case, the loan happened like almost 10 years before in Beijing.
Yeah.
It's something a lot of like miles from New York, right? So why it happened at exact that time in New York, right before the VOA cut off? It's a very, it's a very interesting observation there. And also, Miles Guo is not only a wealthy person. It's not a billionaire. He's the most famous political dissident.
Yeah, that's important.
Or that's not something he described himself. That's per the statement or the definition of the DOJ of United States. So
that's true.
It's not so for me, all these are well planned and are well anchored.
It looks like that way. So that is a very, very good observation here. So I have to say, about the last request, his attorney filed a motion to investigate the authenticity of the documents. It sounds like very normal to everyone.
Yep.
But look into the next slide. Look at those two red circled area. It says that the quote here, judicially is stopped from Miles Guo from challenging at trial the authenticity of the documents, and of course it also includes to challenge the authenticity of some of the signatures, which basically means that Miles Guo is not allowed to look into those, to investigate into the authenticity of the documents, and of course some of the signatures that found that needed to be investigated. And the judge,
David, at that moment, the loan was at least $30 million. It's a serious money, right? When the when the defendant questioned the authenticity, whether the documents are the other side provided is true or fake, I think. To verify a signature is not something as complicated as something beyond or some ability, right? It should be a relatively easy process, right? I just don't understand why Miles Guo was denied of this right.
That should be something we have to bear in our mind. And then let's take a look. It continues on. It's not stopped here. Of course, you mentioned saying the judge not only not allowed Mr. Miles Guo to investigate the documents and the signature, PX, the plaintiff in this case, later motioned for a partial summary judgment. What is meant by partial summary judgment? Basically means that, I cannot explain too much by the legal terms, but what it means is that Mr. Miles Guo was, if it's being granted, then it means that he was denied the right to have his case decided by jury.
Yeah.
And want to see what happens? Let's move on to the next slide. Ladies and gentlemen, let's look at the next slide. Let's see what it says. It says, look at the blue area. It says that the partial summary judgment is granted in favor of Pacific Alliance Asia Opportunity Fund, PAX, which is a subsidiary of PAG. And also, the blue one, which says to the extent of holding Miles Square liable for breach of contract. Now, a 10-year-old loan, nearly 10 years old by the time, and it's being paid. It's paid off already. I cannot understand. We have to ask ourselves a question: why the court will still decide to hold Mr. Miles liable for such kind of contract? It's even worse from here. Let's continue. We will now see why it's got even worse. So how did the question mark here, you see, it says, how did a 30 million loan become a $280 million payment? Because one, the judge ordered the ship Lady May be driven to New York. Two, the fine for parking outside of New York is $500,000 a day, and it's in total 268 days. Then the fines from at that time becomes $1.34 million. Not just there, you have to count in for $30 million of the loan, and you also have to add in the price tag of $120 million of Lady May. So the fine of $1.34 million, or $134 million, I'm sorry, $134 million must be paid in cash and be paid within 5 business days. I will repeat that again. The fine has now become $134 million. 30 million loan, and you have to count in the 30 million loans, and you also have to count in $120 million of Lady May's price tag.
Yeah.
The fine has accrued upon $134 million, and the court ordered it to be paid in cash and be paid within 5 days.
So David, here, the point here is, Miles Gore, he was and he is not the owner of that Lady May, of that boat.
Yeah, the court order says it's not Mr. Miles Gore. The owner of the ship is someone else.
Yeah, he does not have any legal ownership of that boat, or has some kind of equitable interest upon that boat. But the problem is, he's not the owner. Why the court think it's his responsibility to drive the boat back to New York? And
yes.
If he, obviously because it's not his boat, and he was not qualified. He's not entitled to make such kind of a transfer. So that boat is legally, it's not his boat. So
legally not his.
So the court set a fine $500,000 a day. $500,000 a day. David, how much do you own? How much do you make for a year? It's something like $500,000 a day, and he was fined for a total of 268 days. So it's accrued to a total of more than $130 or $4 million. And the judge request him to pay off this more than $100 million in 5 years. It's in cash, not something.
It's in cash.
In stocks.
$134 million in cash.
Can you figure out who can make this payment in 5 days? Maybe
I wonder.
Maybe Mr. Putin has this money in cash.
Maybe he can, but I don't know.
Like a Bill Gates or something like a Warren Buffett. I really doubt they have this kind of like this big cash in hand to pay off like in 5 days. It's kind of like so I think in this case there is only one option left to Moscow. He had to file bankruptcy, right?
He had to file a bankruptcy. Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Yeah, you're right. So we already see in the last bullet point says, we already listed out for you that Miles had to file a Chapter 11 bankruptcy because of that requirement of paying $134 million in cash and within 5 business days. Before we move on, I would like to explain a little bit about the Lady May and its relationship to the loan, because the PAX wants to liquidating or wants to find out how much assets does Mr. Mao's school have, to try to use those things to recoup the entire loan and the interest. Same, right? That's also being written in the documents before. If you're interested, of course, our dear viewers, you can look up into these cases by yourself. But for now, then we have to move on to the next part, which is the Chapter 11 filing. After the Chapter 11 filing, the trustee nomination process has become, quote, interesting, unquote. And interesting here means there's a lot of things happened. Let's move on to see what is going on. So this is basically a quick recover before we now introduce the newest update. The Office of the United States Trustee originally confirmed Joe Whitley as the Chapter 11 trustee of Miles Guo, a very famous dissident who escaped the communist China. However, Joe Whitley was withdrawn. Look at here, I said quote unquote withdrawn on July the 5th by the office of the U.S. trustee without going through the normal process of trustee removal. Then the new trustee, Luc Ardepont, he someone who is from the Paul Hastings LLP, which has a large number of representations of the CCP affiliated entities, has now become the new trustee. But the last point is very important. In the communist China, there is no real private enterprises, but only enterprises that are controlled by the CCP's state-owned companies, and sometimes, of course, the state-owned entities.
Yeah. And David, you know what? You introduced the relationship between Pax and Paul Hastings, right?
Yeah.
We spent several slides to introduce to explain the relationship. Here the Luc Despin, right? This gentleman, this attorney, he's not something like an ordinary employee of this law firm. He's a partner of this law firm. And also, you know what? Actually, when the U.S. trustee office remove the original gentleman Joe Whitley from the position of our trustee, the judge Julie Manning, she herself even was not aware of that change, and he was pretty mad, or you see, angry at that moment, because the Joe Whitley, that gentleman, that poor guy, he already swore in to be a trustee, and suddenly he was removed without a hearing. So even without sent any notice to the judge, it's kind of like wow. I don't know how this could happen.
That's true. That is something, ladies and gentlemen, if you have hear what our co-host Sam is sharing here, that is very important here. Even the judge was not aware when Joe Whitley Zhou Italy was being withdrawn, quote and unquote, withdrawn from the trustee position, but someone called Luc R. Despont was placed on that position. Yeah, so now let's take a look on what is trustee Luc R. Despont's demands. Get yourself prepared. One, I have already summarized it up. So there are 2 points here to look into. One is the transfer economic and corporate governance rights of Mr. Mao's Guo's entities, and 2, act in foreign country on behalf of Mao's Guo's estate. Sam, does that mean that the governance rights and the right to control someone's own assets and entities are being taken over by someone else?
So, David, actually, the transfer and something like the act in foreign country on behalf of the estate. So, actually, these two activities are normal practice. It's not something new. But the problem is, what? There is so obvious evidence, even like David, you and me, we are not professional. We have no like a professional background in law or something like. But even but by common sense, there is obvious or something like or evidence that Luke and the Paul Hastings, they are not disinterested in this case, and
That's true.
You appoint this Luke Despont. He's kind of like according to his speech in the court hearing, he was pretty hostile to Mao's Guo.
I heard that.
He even mentioned Mao's Guo was kind of like has some kind of like a madness or something, serious psychological disorder, something.
Wow. But Mr. Mao's Guo is a famous dissident who is openly to stand up against the Chinese Communist Party, right?
Yep.
That is we know as a fact. So, Sam, I mean, there's something even worse than those two demands, because, ladies and gentlemen, please get yourself prepared. The next slide will be the newest update. The newest update are the following. One, the judge thought that Mao's Guo's counsel's motion of conflict of interest was not persuasive, as mentioned by Sam. and second one is the judge granted that Paul Hastings LLP can be retained as the legal counsel of the trustee Luc R. Despont.
Yep.
So we have to ask ourselves $4 million questions. Next slide, please. Number one, how a $30 million case became nearly $300 million case itself. Two, is it normal to require Mao's Guo to pay off a fine of $134 million within 5 business days?
Yeah.
3, why was the original trustee removed without proper procedure after the original trustee sworn in? The fourth one is Paul Hastings LLP really disinterested in this case? And the last question, since we have to ask ourselves, is this a simple bankruptcy case? Especially after we know that Mr. Mao's Guo is a famous dissident who stand up against the evil Chinese Communist Party regime.
Yeah, David. Yeah, it's time to wrap up our episode today. But let's go back to the very basics of this case. It's a loan of $30 million happened almost 10 years before in Beijing, which is 6,000, 7,000 miles from New York, right? So this is one basic. The second basic is, Mr. Guo was denied of several rights he deserved.
Very
for example,
rights.
or a jewelry, the selection of jewelry, right? And the third, the court issued a fine that's $500,000 a day, which set a record in the whole United States. I guess so. But if our audience has, we welcome our audience to do our independent research or even to challenge our fact. But as to the best of my knowledge here, that sets a record in the United States, right? And it's a very ridiculous. It's when I was called in, when I called in for the previous hearing, it's kind of like ironic that Luc Despon was kind of like want to expand his our role
subpoena power
to unlimited. Okay, he want to act on behalf of the estate to kind of like to look for or to dig every penny of Mr. Guo from the whole world using the money from the estate itself. Oh, it's very funny. Right now, David, it becomes very interesting. In the New York court, it looks it's my opinion. It's not something. It's just my subjective opinion. It's not something like a well planned, something like a scheme to punish everyone else. How can you do that to kind of like oppose like CCP? And in this bankruptcy case, right? I don't believe that the judge is biased or something. At least but obviously he's kind of. She's kind of like are misled. So I have a feeling that every part except the judge herself knows this is not something like our bankruptcy case. It's something much bigger than a Chapter 11 bankruptcy case.
That is true, Sam. I have to say that it is after hearing what you say, that is something very serious. So if you might be asking, so our dear viewers and ladies and gentlemen, you might be asking yourselves what we can do. Let's move on to the last slide. If you're really interested in the newest updates of the case, tomorrow on the Eastern Standard Time, 1 p.m. on August the 4th, there will be a court hearing, which is on the Mr. Miles Guo's bankruptcy case. So now we posting the toll-free number, which is shown on the screen, is 1-877-336-1274. This is a listen-only number with the access code 1077800. And we strongly encourage you to call in to listen the hearing, to follow up the newest development of the bankruptcy case.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, dear viewers, for joining us tonight. I'm your host, David Stolwacher, and with me,
Sam. Yeah, I'm your co-host, Sam. I really appreciate every audience to spend time with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us, and we wish you a good night. Good night.
The Chinese Communist Party has fiercely assaulted the American judicial system while most Americans slept. The 5-year legal battle between Pax and Miles Guo goes far beyond an ordinary debt collection and becomes a battleground for defending American justice free from the CCP's interference. Protecting Americans' judicial independence is the responsibility of the American people. We are the new Chinese who are taking down the CCP, and we're here to help. The plaintiff and creditor, PAX, Pacific Alliance Asia Opportunity Fund, is a subsidiary of PAG, Pacific Alliance Group, headed by Shan Weijian, a CCP-registered spy with a public persona of a successful venture capitalist and a seasoned executive. Representing PAX is the international law firm O'Malveny, one of the first U.S. law firms to set up in Communist China, and was just awarded a top practice in Communist China in June 2022. The defendant, debtor Miles Guo, the seventh son of a poor rural family with 8 boys. At age 13, he's already made fortunes with his various business adventures. At age 19, he was persecuted by the CCP for providing financial aid to the 1989 June 4th student movement, but survived the 22 months torture at the Qingfeng detention center. In 2015, he fled China and started the whistleblower movement in 2017. Mr. Guo's truth-telling broadcastings have awakened hundreds of millions of Chinese from the mind-controlling spells the CCP has cast on its people and the world. Hence, he became the most formidable enemy of the CCP. Let's start with the scandalous incident that occurred most recently in the U.S. Bankruptcy Court District of Connecticut. On June 15, 2022, the court issued a memorandum of decision granting the United States trustee UST's motion for the appointment of a Chapter 11 trustee. 15 days later, on June 30, 2022, the UST filed a notice appointing Joe D. Whitley as Chapter 11 trustee and an application for seeking the court's approval of the appointment of Whitley as Chapter 11 trustee. On July 5, 2022, the day of the scheduled hearing of Whitley's appointment, UST notified the court that it would withdraw the application for the appointment of Whitley as the Chapter 11 trustee. What was supposed to be an appointment hearing of Whitley becomes a heated 39-minute debate between the judge and the UST on if the UST should have followed the procedure outlined in the Bankruptcy Code in removing Whitley, who at the time of this hearing had signed an affidavit under penalty of perjury declaring his disinterestedness. Despite the judge's inquiry, the UST attorney Holly Claiborne asserted that the UST has the governmental privilege and does not need to discuss or explain how the UST selects a trustee. Nevertheless, Claiborne emphasized the need for the UST to select and install an individual who can be impartial to all parties in the July 5th hearing. Only 2 days later, on July 7, 2022, the UST filed a notice appointing Luke A. Despens, a partner at Paul Hastings LLP, as Chapter 11 trustee, and an application seeking the court's approval of the appointment. Like O'Malveny, Paul Hastings has a significant and active presence in Communist China. Upon obtaining this news, Mr. Guo posted on Getter on the same day, stating that Paul Hastings is a long-term partner of PEG, the Plantif PEG's parent company in China, and Luke A. Despens is not a disinterested person. This news rattled many followers of the whistleblower movement, who shortly after Miles' post located a shocking amount of evidence online about the close tie Paul Hastings has with PAG and the Chinese Communist Party. The next day, July 8, 2022, Luke A. Despens attended the hearing of his appointment and conveniently told the judge his earlier admission, Paul Hastings' representation of PAG-PEG. The followers of the whistleblower movement were furious at the time, and they turned their emotions into actions. They dug deeply into this matter and exposed more findings on social media. Probably under pressure, on July 12, 2022, Luke A. Despens filed his first supplemental declaration of disinterestedness, in which he declared that Paul Hastings represented certain entities that share a common parent with PAX. He did not disclose any details regarding those representations, other than to state that they were in unrelated matters. Why did the UST approach the two trustees, Whitley and Despens, differently? In Whitley's case, the UST perceived the purported conflict and immediately withdrew Whitley, ignoring the removal process outlined in the Bankruptcy Code, as well as the fact Whitley and his firm were not directly involved in the conflict. In Despens' case, the late-rising conflict relates to the PAC's parent company, PEG, and the UST moved forward with the appointment at lightning speed, not to mention that the UST willfully ignored the undue influence that the Chinese government maintains over Paul Hastings by controlling its ability to do business in China and Hong Kong. Why did the UST hastily select the second trustee in just 2 days? Why it failed its first decision, made over 15 days from June 15th to 30th. In the next episode, we will share critical information about this case and the CCP's presence and interference in the American judicial system so you can get closer to the bottom of these questions.